But first, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the June 2nd, 2023 SANDAG Regional Planning Committee joint session with the Shoreline Preservation Working Group. I'm Dwight Worden, City Council in Del Mar. I'm chair of the Shoreline Working Group, and the Shoreline Working Group reports to the Regional Planning Committee. But since none of the leadership positions in the Planning Committee are here, they conscripted me to chair the meeting. So I will be your interim chair for today. Before I move forward, I would like to ask our interpreter, Ruth Monroy, how to access interpretation for those who need it. Ruth?
Yes, thank you. The following announcement is for remote participants, and I will repeat the message in English. Para hacer uso del servicio de interpretación, por favor, desplácese a la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom, donde aparecen los controles. Haga clic en el icono de interpretación, que es el globo terráqueo, y seleccione Spanish, español. Si está utilizando la aplicación móvil de Zoom en celular o tableta, presione los puntos suspensivos, luego Interpretation y luego el idioma. To use the interpreting feature, please scroll to the bottom of the Zoom screen where the meeting controls are located and click on the interpretation icon, the world. Then select your language. If you are joining using the Zoom mobile app on a cell phone or tablet, please press the ellipses, then interpretation, and then choose your language. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ruth. Next, I would ask our clerk, Tessalero, to confirm that we have a quorum for both the planning group and the working group.
Thank you, Chair. We do have a quorum for both regional planning and shoreline preservation.
All right, thank you all for coming. Next, I would like to start the meeting with the Kumeyaay land acknowledgement. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been part of this land and continue to be. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the SANDAG community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony. We find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. I will now officially call the meeting to order and welcome you all again. This is going to be, I promise, the most informative, fun meeting you're going to have all month, perhaps all year, depending on what meetings you go to. All righty, so let's start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, for members of the public, there are some agendas in the back of the room. And if you do want to speak on an agenda item, there are speaker slips you can fill out and turn them in, and we will call on you when the agenda item comes up. So on item 1, this is an opportunity for members of the public to comment on items that are not on the agenda. If you want to comment on something that is on the agenda, we'll call on you when that item is called. So let me ask Tessa, do we have any members of the public that wish to speak under this item?
Thank you, Chair. I have 2 members in person. The first is Catherine Rhodes. Please come to the podium.
Hi, my name is Catherine Rhodes, and I'm a civil engineer. And so when I was in my 30s, my partner allowed me to quit my job and do whatever I wanted. And I did a lot of political things in 2008. At the end of 2008, I was bored, and I heard a thing about the city is giving the lawyer $1 million for legal fees for the children's pool in La Jolla. And I'm like, let me look into this, because I never looked into it because there were so many great people already looking into it and had it under control. And so the first thing I saw is like, hey, that's a sand trap. And if they dredge the sand trap, it's going to cause cliff erosion and retreat from the beginning of the littoral cell at La Jolla Cove to very close to the children's pool. So you never dredge a sand trap close to the beginning of a littoral cell. It's like basic. And so then I looked at the old EIR, and Dr. Inman basically wrote a wonderful letter for the EIR when they tried to do that back in 2003. And I was like, holy moly, I figured it out. myself, and I only took one class, and I figured out that he was the one who wrote the book. And so I asked him to, because I wanted to dredge, I basically called him up and said, hey, would you write a new letter for the new EIR? And he said, I can't because it's political now. And people at UCSD and Scripps says nobody's allowed to talk about it. And I'm like, okay, but he gave me such great advice. What he gave me, the advice is go to the back of the EIR and call every single person that's on that list. So I called SANDAG, and SANDAG said it's not in our purview. It is in your purview. That would have been catastrophic failure. And so, I went down the list, and then the first time I called the Army Corps of Engineers, I forgot Northern California somewhere, but then I found out that we actually had one in Carlsbad. And so this lovely lady, on the last day that the EIR was available, she wrote a letter saying, we are concerned with the lack of integration of the CEQA and EPA process. During our October 2018 meetings, we encouraged the city to prepare a joint CEPA and EPA document. And what the city tried to do is they try to go by without doing anything. But I just wanted to mention that, there was a huge failure, I believe, that people at Scripps or UCSD cannot talk about different issues if they're political. I think that you guys should have been able to speak freely on the issue. And then SANDAG was such a big failure on it. They said, basically, we don't have a problem with it. It was horrible. Thank you.
Thank you for your input. Many elected officials here and staff have listened to it and heard it. However, since this is an off-agenda item, we're not in a position to discuss it here today or to take an action on it. So thank you for your input. We do have another speaker too, right?
Yes, Chair. We have Dr. Timothy Bilaashka, who will be our final speaker on this item.
Good afternoon, joint meeting. My name is Timothy Bilaashka. I'm a physician and a research scientist trained in graduate physics in a wide array of areas from solid state to biology. I speak to you this afternoon. I know you have a busy agenda, but I've been to many SANDAG meetings over the past 2 years in particular, been in the area for 15 years, and I'd like to make a recommendation. I didn't realize until recently some of the differences between the professional groups. And primarily, SANDAG is a great bunch of engineers. They have one of the best executive administrative staffs I've seen in any organization, and my kudos go out to them. I don't like politics, especially bickering and beating up people for no reason. And I think SANDAG has undergone a tremendous amount of unnecessary distraction with that in the past 2 years. That said, I wanted to make a suggestion because although I really appreciate engineers, I'm not an engineer. I can't do a lot of that stuff. But I am a scientist at heart, and I am well trained, and I've talked with many people over time. And I don't believe that SANDAG has any scientists on staff. And engineers do a job, they get a contract, there's a scope of work, and you don't go an inch outside the right of way. And yet SANDAG is doing everything that is everything, trying to coordinate and herd cats in so many different ways and doing a great job at it. So I'd like to recommend for the RTP 2025 plan that SANDAG consider appointing 3, could be non-paying volunteer scientists, but I use that term loosely because I find academics are a little focused, hyper-focused, and maybe removed, and engineers are project-oriented. There's a lot of retired people and farmers who've been dealing with a topic I would call sustainable farming. Small farms, 200-acre farms, ground cover, no-till soil, regenerative soils. And in that regard, I wanted to mention a resource I found recently, heard her talk. She's from New Zealand, name of Nicole Masters. One of the books she wrote was For the Love of Soil, and talks about the mycorrhizomes under the soil that go away when you dig them up. Takes 3 to 8 years to regenerate. and that healthy soils can support absorbing 10 inches of rainwater in an hour rather than having run off and then flood everything with the damage. So I'd like to see some attention paid somewhere to regenerative soils in the projects that SANDAG's included in. And I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bilash. Again, we appreciate the comments. We've heard them, but we're not in a position to discuss or talk about them. So let me just double check, Tessa, that's it?
That concludes the public comments on this item.
All right, thank you. Then there are a lot of us here today, but this is an opportunity at this time. If anybody wants to make a comment about something that they feel is important, we'll give you the floor to do that. There'll be lots of opportunity to chat when we get to the topics that are on the agenda. But if anybody would like to say something right now, just shoot your hand up in the air and I will call on you. I saw a hand way down there at the end. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to say hi. My name is Eric Joyce. I'm from Oceanside. It's my first time in a SANDAG meeting. So it's really great to see everybody around the table ready to get to work. That's it.
All right. Thank you, Eric, and welcome. Anybody else? If not, I wanted to make a brief announcement on behalf of the working group. SANDAG and the Surfrider Foundation are going to be partnering in a beach cleanup in Imperial Beach. It'll be on June 17th from 10 in the morning till noon. And we're inviting all of you, and please spread the word in your community for people to come. All you need to do is show up. You don't need to bring anything special. There will be equipment, gloves, and pickup devices, whatever, available at the site. If you would like to come, we would ask you to leave your name with, I guess, Courtney, so that she can have a record and get the waivers from you that we need for you to do that. Courtney, anything else?
Yes, I will also make sure to email the registration link and more details also after today's meetings concludes.
All right, thank you. So I will look forward to seeing you all on the beach in Imperial Beach. I've done these many times and it's amazing how much stuff you pick up, and it will shock you how many cigarette butts there are on parts of the beach where you didn't think there were any. All right, moving along. The next item on it is our agency report, and I'm pleased to introduce the Deputy CEO of SANDAG, Colleen Clemenson. Colleen.
Thank you so much, Chair, and welcome everyone. It's so great to have this joint meeting with the Shoreline Working Group. At least in my career at SANDAG, which has been over 10 years, I think this is the first time we've held a joint meeting with you all. So this is terrific. It's important for us to be working together and really in the spirit of more collaboration, which is where we're heading as an agency. This is super important. So I just had a few updates before you get to your business of the day. Earlier this week, I was in Sacramento at a safety summit that was sponsored by Caltrans, and it brought together all the directors from all of the districts in Caltrans, as well as many other entities, to talk about the importance of safety on our roadways, not only the highways, but local streets and roads. And this is really in alignment with what the SANDAG Board of Directors has approved, which is Vision Zero. And I know many local jurisdictions have as well, to get to zero fatalities. And I think the big theme that comes out of this is that using the transportation system, it shouldn't be acceptable that we just accept fatalities as part of that. That if you're going out and using the transportation system, that we expect that people are going to die. There are about 12 people each week who die in the San Diego region, and about a third of those who are fatally, or the fatalities, are pedestrians and bicyclists. And so this is why it's so important for us to be investing in a transportation system that is safe for all. A couple of other things just to mention: we're continuing work on restoring the Del Mar Bluffs and working on the double tracking in the Low San project. So that's the rail line between San Diego and up to San Luis Obispo. But the piece that we're working on is in the San Diego region. We have $300 million from the state of California to actually get the rails into a tunnel in the Del Mar area, partially city of San Diego and Del Mar. And we've received half the funding for the construction of the San Diego Bridge. And and the Del Mar platform. And we've been on multiple calls with the Federal Rail Administration and are extremely hopeful that we'll get the other half of the funding to begin construction on that bridge within the next few months. So great progress there. We participated in a Senate subcommittee hearing up in Sacramento to continue to move this project along. And at the same time, we're working to get additional funding for the new border crossing, the third border crossing at Otay Mesa, making a lot of progress there. We're still working with the federal agencies, but extremely close on having that done. And then just a couple of other things I wanted to mention. If any of you are interested in tours of Otay Mesa East, we welcome the opportunity to take you down there. This last week, our staff was down with Melanie Burkholder, who's a council member from Carlsbad, giving her a tour of the facility. And so we just think it's really important. It's a huge investment for the region, but it's also important for the state of California and the nation as a whole. So we're happy to take anyone down there who is interested. And then we're doing a lot of work on smart corridors, and I'm looking at Ann Fox, who's our representative from Caltrans District 11 here today. A lot of work to look at how we deploy technology to really make the highway system work better. Part of that also is looking at the infrastructure that we have for the electric vehicle charging, and we're now starting work on a new neighborhood electric vehicle shuttle service, and we're working on 2 of those. So there's a pilot that will be going in Pacific Beach, and this will help get people from the beach communities to the stations along the mid-coast. And then we're also working on one with the city of Oceanside. So hopefully these pilots will be hugely successful and we can see them in other places throughout the region. So with that, I will conclude and thank you for the opportunity and welcome everyone.
Thank you, Colleen. Let's see, before I call on any public comment, does anybody on the panel have a question? Yes, Rebecca.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up one quick thing. I've actually been hearing quite a bit from cyclists recently talking about the safety of bike lanes right next to parking spaces, and then also just in the cycle tracks themselves, because they are very narrow. And many cyclists that I come in contact with, specifically in North County, many of them are, in big groups, and the cycle tracks are really confining. And I know something just happened in Encinitas, and I'm not quite exactly sure. They were trying to explain it to me, but I haven't had a chance to actually go drive it yet. But I think we need maybe a little more feedback from maybe North County cyclists as to what actually fits their needs, so that we're not building bicycle lanes or, specific areas for them to cycle and they don't feel safe, because then that kind of defeats what we're actually trying to do with Vision Zero. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Question for Colleen? All right, let me ask Tessa, do we have any public speakers that wanted to address us on this topic?
Thank you. Yes, we have one public speaker in person. Catherine Rhodes, please come to the podium.
Hello, Catherine Rhodes, and just a little bit of things. When I went to your agenda, a lot of the links don't work, like the second link for number 5, all the attachments for number 6, and part of number 7. So I wasn't able to do it. But what I recommend is you actually put it down. I don't want to go and get more paperwork. I wouldn't mind something that's 500 pages or less. If you could just put it all together, and maybe if you could put it online, that would be great, because I'm not prepared. Okay. And then I want to mention, I wish we had a Vision Zero for homeless. I wish people cared about having a Vision Zero for homeless, but instead, Council President Whitburn and our cruel, mean, strong mayor, Todd Gloria, are putting a ordinance on that's going to be moving the homeless out of downtown around Petco Park, specifically because they can't be next to places that are already taking care of homeless, like St. Vincent de Paul. And they're also going to move them out of Hillcrest. And what it's going to do is they're going to move all the homeless people to the coastal zone, because the coastal zone will not get passed. The ordinance has to go through the California Coastal Commission. And the California Coastal Commission already said that they wouldn't do anything that cruel, because this land belongs to us. And so anyway, I have a really good solution that the city refuses to look at. Finally, the city, I've been telling the city that, The homeless emergency shelter crisis allows you to put homeless shelters anywhere without CEQA, anywhere you want. You guys have, if you have that, the county has that, the county can do anything they want. We could literally solve our homeless problem. And so, but instead of doing that, they're putting forth an ordinance. In the ordinance, the word homeless or the word housing is not in there. There is not one word of housing or homeless. All it is criminalization of the poor. It's horrible. I would like all of you guys, if you can, to call into the city council, even put things down and say, hey, I don't want you to push your problem into our neighborhoods. They're going to be moving to East County, unincorporated San Diego County, and then Steve Whitman could look like a hero for, hurting all the people in downtown. The other thing is for Army Corps of Engineers. The city of San Diego is literally trying to steal the Neil Good Day Center and use it for the police. They tried to do it before. When I had meetings with your staff, they said, oh, they would never do anything like that. And I said, no, they tried it before. Well, they're trying it again. And so, that's something, the city is terrible at this. So anyway, if any of you could call the city up on Tuesday, June 6th, and say, how dare you try to do this? It's horrible, it's mean, it's cruel. It doesn't solve homeless and it doesn't discuss housing. Thank you.
Thank you for your input. Tessa, anybody else?
That concludes the public comments.
All right. Thank you very much. And let me just check with legal counsel. I think the homeless policy is not part of our agenda today, so it's really probably not appropriate for us to take it up. But I don't want there to be an inference by silence that we didn't listen or we don't care. Or if anybody really feels they want to make a response, I think the Brown Act would allow a brief response. All right, let's move on. Thank you all. And item 3 we're up to was a report from the working group chairs. And let me call on Joy Lyons first, who is the chair of the Sustainable Communities Working Group. Joy.
Thank you, Chair Warden. My name is Joy Lyons. I'm the Deputy Mayor of the City of Encinitas and the new chair of the Sustainable Communities Working Group. My first meeting was this month, and I'll do a brief overview of what our main topics were. I do want to also say, though, that I'm the alternate on this regional planning committee for North County Coastal. So the brief update is we had presentations on 3 topics that were status presentations. The first was anti-displacement strategy update. And on this, it was overviewed as a beta site of information that SANDAG is regional planning is developing, where there'll be information on affordable housing case studies, who, how, where, aggregating all the information that is existing within the county. Also, it's an update on local staffing assistance for all the municipalities in the region and best practices for to share amongst all of us on anti-displacement. The next topic was Service Bureau options. Service Bureau is responsible for transportation modeling, and as we all know, there's delays in receiving this modeling. There were some options presented, including phasing out transportation modeling at SANDAG, charging higher prices to cover the service gaps, or getting additional technical assistance. It was good for them to hear the feedback from the Sustainable Communities Group on that topic. The final presentation was on regional growth forecasting updates. This was a status report also on who we are, what housing we have, what jobs we have, what population we have, and what the forecast is for our whole region on where we're going, associated then, of course, with what our housing needs will be. Thank you for the opportunity to give the update.
All right, thank you for that. Let's take a moment and see if any on the panel have a question for Joy while it's fresh in your mind, and then I'll move on to one more working group report, and then we'll call on public comment. Anybody want to ask Joy anything about what she reported? All right, you must have done an excellent job, Joy. They got it all. All right, the other item is the Shoreline Working Group, and all our members are here. And as the chair, I'll give you a very brief report. We are, I think, unless somebody corrects me, the longest standing committee in SANDAG. We've been in existence since the 1980s, I think. Wow, shocking for me to think that I was actually involved since then. We do everything shoreline related. There are 10 cities in the county with that share part of the shoreline. There's an airport, there's a port district, and there's the military. And they're all represented on our group. And our primary function is to be a clearinghouse to gather information and scientific data and to be able to share it with all the stakeholders in shoreline practices, the city and the airports and the military and the port, et cetera. And we do a very good job of that. We do annual surveys of what's going on the beach. Where's the sand coming from? Where's it going to? And we report that. We study the long-term trends. We work closely with our confederates at Scripps Institute, some of whom you'll hear from later today, to keep us up on the latest science. So I guess a takeaway would be those of you that don't have the time to work on this topic full time, but have an interest in it, view the Shoreline Working Group as we're a resource for you. Your representative to it can get you information and get you access to stuff that you might like to know. And we have more fun than a sock full of monkeys. So if you've got nothing better to do, come and sit in on our meetings. All right, let me check with Tessa. Tessa, is there any public member that wanted to comment on this topic?
There are no public comments on this item.
All right, then anybody have a question for the Shoreline Working Group? Anybody on the working group that wanted to add something that I skipped over? All right, moving right along, we're getting to the fun stuff. The next item is we have one consent agenda item, and that is the minutes for the regional planning group. And this is a voting item for them, but only for them. So if you're a regional planning group member, you should have a clicker at your desk and you can electronically vote. And I guess we would entertain a motion by somebody to approve the minutes. Moved by Councilmember Whitburn. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Jones. Any discussion? Seeing none, let's call for the vote. For those of you on the regional planning group, push your clicker. All right, if I'm reading that thing correctly, it looks like the minutes passed. And I probably should have asked if there were public comments on this before we voted, but let's better late than never. Tessa, do we? We're missing a vote. Who we? Okay, well, hang on. That's a good thing because now I can ask, are there any public commenters that wanted to comment on this before we do the vote?
There are no public comments on this item.
All right. Then if you're having trouble with your device, just tell us yes or no. All right. She records a yes. Is that good enough?
There we go.
All right. So the minutes for the regional planning group have been adopted and that completes this item.
We know they're all yes, but I'm assuming they were.
I
didn't see that they changed the.
Can we redo the vote?
Yes. All right. There we go. Do you, yes. Yeah.
So that motion
that-
passes.
Do you
with
still
those
want us to
members
redo
present.
it?
No.
No. Okay. So the minutes have passed unanimously with yes votes. All right. The next item on our agenda is reports, and on item number 5, this is going to be Keith Greer from SANDAG, who's going to introduce Dr. Merrifield and tell us what we need to know. Keith.
So next item, I'll introduce Dr. Merrifield. This item, we're going back to item number 5, I believe. And item number 5 is the formation of a technical task force. Hello, committee members and working group members. Good to see you. For those who don't know me, my name is Keith Greer. I'm one of the planning managers that work on our environmental programs at SANDAG. Item 5 is a short item on an informational item for the Shoreline Preservation Working Group members on the creation of a new SANDAG task force to take a deep dive into how sand is moving in the oceanside littoral cell. And I said littoral cell, and some of you guys have glazed over and said, what's a littoral cell? But just as kind of information, a littoral cell is kind of a closed system of sand and how sand moves within an area. We have 3 littoral cells in San Diego. We have the oceanside cell, which actually goes all the way up to San Clemente. We have the Mission Bay littoral cell, primarily in the city of San Diego, and we have the Silver Strand littoral cell. In traditional thinking, it's been that sand enters the north of these littoral cells, it moves along and then exits these deep water canyons and is lost to the system itself. So that recent research has challenged that traditional way of thinking. Working group members might remember that Dr. William O'Reilly and Ms. Gopel had from Scripps kind of talked about how these sublittoral cells or these mini cells were probably more important for keeping sand in the system. And we have talked about the formation of a proposed task force to look at these subcells and how the sand's actually moving in these various 3 littoral cells. So we're proposing a technical task force, and that technical task force would consist of both members of the working group and technical experts and sand managers and people from Scripps to look at sand movement. So what's a technical task force? So SANDAG uses these for very specific technical topics. For example, we have one looking at the broadband digital divide. We have one on goods movement. We have another technical task force on habitat conservation. They meet for a period of time, short period of time. They're non-Brown Act, and they allow a deep technical discussion on one technical topic. We've envisioned that this technical task force would meet every 6 weeks over a 10-month period. We probably have 2 longer workshops where we'd invite the public. And then if it was successful, we'd move from the oceanside littoral cell to the other 2 littoral cells accordingly. With the idea is that we would update our current policies with more traditional current scientific thinking right now. So with that, there's no action on this item. It's just an informational item only. Shoreline Preservation Working Group members, if you're interested in serving on the task force and you have the time to commit and the interest to take a deep dive in looking at sand, we request that you submit an email of interest to Courtney Pesh, our staff member who's the PM Shoreline Manager. We will host the first meeting in July or August, and we'll report back to the Shoreline Preservation Working Group meetings and tell us about progress. With that, that concludes my presentation. I turn it over to the chair if there's any questions I may answer.
Thank you, Keith. Any questions for Keith about the sediment task force? Yes.
Just to comment that I'm really supportive of this idea, and I think that this is a path forward for us to be able to work together to collectively better manage our sediment instead of coming at this like turf wars of this really precious resource that matters a lot to all of us. So thank you for the efforts, and I look forward to crafting better policies with the science that we're going to develop from this process.
All right, thank you, Keith. I would just note there's lots going on in the Oceanside Littoral Cell. It's where the Army Corps of Engineers is doing a major 50-year project to put sand on parts of Encinitas Beach and most all of Solana Beach. Oceanside has its own project to look at sand replenishment and retention, and they're in the littoral cell. So if you've ever wanted to pound sand or say you pound sand, this is your chance. And I would note for the record, I have volunteered and hope to be participating in the committee. Are there any public comments on this item, Tessa?
Chair, I still have
Yes,
a
I'm
question.
sorry, Paloma.
Thank you. So I'm just wondering how the collaboration with Army Corps is going to take place. Are they going to be part of the task force?
Yeah, they'd be one of the technical experts we'd invite to the meeting to be part of that sand, understanding the sand transfer.
And could that be the stepping point to look at more regional projects beyond the ocean side? Obviously, I'm interested. In
Absolutely. I hope that this will be a stepping stone to look at all the 3 littoral cells and move forward to the next nourishment project.
That's great. I echo my colleague Hinsey's comments as well. I think it's really positive that we're establishing this. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Paloma. I think some of us, and certainly me, feel the ultimate solution here is to expand the Army Corps project to address the entire shoreline in San Diego County with an ongoing management plan for sand. But this will be a step in that direction. Any other questions? Yeah, Eric.
I would just echo Councilmember Hinsey's comments and say from Oceanside's perspective, we're really excited about having more competent and technical conversations that reflect the best science that we know. So thank you for pursuing it.
All right, anybody else? Yes, sir.
Just echoing everyone's comments, but wanted to mention, because as part of what City of Oceanside is doing is part of the bigger, they're doing a design competition for a sand retention device and looking for sand sources too. But part of it, I think they're doing a similar study. They've contracted with GHD. I imagine it's probably more about the subcell within Oceanside itself, but they are a part of that. What the city's funding is actually a subcell, Oceanside littoral cell subcell study within Oceanside. So definitely be worth talking with them as well in regards to this task force.
All right, thank you for that. Keith, do you have a deadline when you want to receive emails from people?
A couple weeks, 2 weeks, please.
Couple of weeks. All right, so think about it, and hopefully some of you will want to participate. All right, now, did we have any public comment on this agenda item, Tessa?
I do have one public commenter, Catherine Rhodes. Please come to the podium.
Hello, this is Catherine Rhodes. I just want to mention Dr. Inman of Scripps actually created the concept of the literal cell, and a wonderful movie. If you guys, that's wonderful. You could just watch on YouTube. And I was just watching it. Was Beach, the River of Sand movie, and it's literally about the oceanside literal cell. It's beautiful. So, you know, I would say look into that. So anyway, you know, as a civil engineer, I always try to find things I, you know, don't understand. And when I was looking at the, I forgot what they're called, the zones for the mineral resource zones. I looked at the map, and the map said that San Diego Bay is not worthy of looking into because it's not a place where we have good sand or gravel. But the thing is, it's not. We have never, what I want to do is something I call my La Playa plan of a full tideline reclamation of our port or airport by Liberty Station over by Midway. And what it would do, it would future-proof against sea level rise. Since I brought this up, the Navy Broadway complex is actually doing the bathtub foundation. And then also for Seaport Village, they're planning on doing the bathtub foundation. Finally, the airport did 2 cisterns that I've been talking about. We could create space underground for transportation, water capture, stormwater capture. We could get money for reclamation from the state and federal government. We've never looked into it. But going back to the mineral resource map, back in the, I believe, I forgot it was the 70s or 80s when the map came out, Mineral Resource Zone 1 said it's an urbanized area or a place where sand is not that good. But then in further iterations of the map, updated map, they took out the word urban. So they don't mention, because it's urbanized, that's not why we were saying you can't take out the sand right now because, you know, there's a street on it or, you know, people are living in the Midway area. So it's never been analyzed ever. And I say we have a gold mine of sand and gravel. San Diego County pays the highest cost of sand and gravel of anybody. We get our sand and gravel from Canada by barge. So we have never used our natural resources that we own. It's owned by, and the thing is, you know, when I talk to people at the port, they don't understand what I'm talking about. But maybe some of you guys would. And so anyway, my La Playa plan, if you want to find it, it's located at tinyurl-20220419A or 2022. It was April 19th when I put it there. And so if some of you could actually look at it and you can see how rich we are here in San Diego. We're so rich. Thank you.
Thank you for your input. Last call for comments. Not seeing any. Let's move on to agenda item 6. And this is Rising Ocean, the Science and Policy of Sea Level Rise. This item will be presented by Dr. Mark Merrifield from Scripps Institute of Oceanography and Keith Greer from SANDAG. And it's in 2 parts, an A and a B. And I think we're going to take both presentations and then your comments and questions and public input after that. So Keith, take it away.
Thank you, Chair Warden. I'm excited about today because it's the first time we've had Regional Planning Committee and Shoreline together talking about shoreline policies. So this is a topic that SANDAG has a long history about, and you'll hear about it today. And let me give you kind of a roadmap of what we're going to talk about. So the first presentation will be a 2-part. Dr. Merrifield, who I'll introduce in a second, we'll talk about the science of sea level rise, how much, you know, how fast, how certain are we? And then I'll follow up with a presentation on the policies in place to how the region adapt to that coastal adaptation for sea level rise. We'll take a break, as Chair Warden said, we'll answer some questions, and then we'll have a final presentation by Ms. Courtney Pesh of our staff, who will present the current planning efforts and projects to adapt to a rising ocean. So with that, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Mark Merrifield. Dr. Merrifield is a professor in Integrated Oceanography Division of Scripps Institute of Oceanography. He's the director and an endowed chair of the Center for Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation. He's an internationally recognized researcher in the areas of sea level rise, climate stability, coastal oceanography, and nearshore processes, and was the lead author for the Sea Level Rise chapter of the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Prior to joining Scripps, Dr. Merrifield spent 20 years as the director of University of Hawaii's Sea Level Center. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Merrifield. And Dr. Merrifield, presentation yours.
Okay. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was a postdoc of Reinhard Flick, so I think I should add that to the any discussion of global sea level rise goes to first the altimeters. So satellite altimetry is the way we are fairly certain of what the global rise is averaged over the Earth. So the top panel there is showing the series of satellites that have been in place. And so everything is a kind of a variation around the global average, which is about 3.4 millimeters per year, just a little over an inch per decade. And we have other data sets like tide gauges, some salt marsh data sets that are showing that the altimeter record clearly is a acceleration over what we experienced over the last century. So I would say the instrumental record is fairly certain on the rise rate. For San Diego, there's been a tide gauge in San Diego Harbor since the early 1900s. That's the black line layer overlaid. There's the red line, the estimate of the global average. And so you can see that San Diego has risen a little faster than the global average. Some of that is due to land motion. So on the right-hand side there, everywhere you see is blue, the land is sinking slightly at rates that are similar to the sea level rise. So in San Diego, we're getting a little higher rate because we're sinking faster than some of the other areas along the coast. You can also see from the black line in that left-hand plot that we get glimpses of what's to come during what are these called El Nino years. So everywhere where it's rising, half a foot above average, that's the El Nino impact years, and we're due for one possibly this year coming up. I think I'll skip that one. So where are we headed? So there are a lot of tools for this. I would recommend that if we want sort of the most up-to-date, that you go to this interagency report, Global and Regional Sea Level Rise Scenarios for the United States. It gives a nice detailed overview of the kind of the scientific consensus on where we are with sea level rise, and also a lot of tools that have been developed by NOAA and NASA to really dig into your own backyard. Here's one here for San Diego showing what we can expect for going forward under what they're calling intermediate low, intermediate up to high scenarios. The scenarios are based on different assumptions and about how much greenhouse gas is going to be in the atmosphere going forward. And you can see there the observed record blending into the projections going forward. So the projections are, you may be able to see it there. There's a yellow line that's just below the colored areas there. And that's if you extrapolate how our current sea level trend, extrapolate it forward. So we're kind of on the intermediate low to even low range of what the projections are right now. And so there's a lot of debate about how good these sort of extrapolations are, but certainly we're not tracking the higher rates that you might expect going forward. So one of the outcomes of this report was that even with all this uncertainty, so not only are these paths diverging, but you see those hazed lines are the colored areas behind each line, which is the uncertainty of the scenario itself. But by mid-century, no matter which path you're on, we're looking at about this is the old, sorry about that. I changed all this to feet, but this is all in meters. So it's going to be about a foot or so above the 2000 baseline going into that decade or mid-decade. So that, even though there's uncertainty on pathways, that's pretty solid. No matter which scenario we're on, we're kind of on that course. You may wonder what's causing all the discrepancy here. Why are these things so different? Why are the intermediate low to high scenarios so different? And that's all about ice. So on the left hand, these box plots here on the bottom are showing the various contributions to sea level from whether we're warming the ocean, whether it's melting glaciers, Greenland, Antarctica, vertical land motion, which we see as an issue in San Diego. And as you go left to right there from low to high scenario, you see the one box that's changing is how much Antarctica and Greenland are going to melt as we go forward. And on the right-hand side, there are the measurements from space that are confirming these current rates are quite alarming. And the reason you see a lot of press about it, Greenland and Antarctica, is that these are the #1 concerns going forward when it comes to sea level rise. This is what the high scenario would look like. And you can see here going from sort of like I think the high range there's almost 6 feet by the end of the century. And just how big this Antarctica contribution could be. And that's the big question going forward. Okay, so that's the record. Is there something about the physical record we can look at to kind of inform our adaptive planning as we go forward? When do we start to make changes? When are we expecting sort of a new scenario that we might have to deal with? One of the ways is just looking at when water levels are going to exceed certain thresholds. And this is what's called the still water level. We're not including waves here, but just looking at with high tide flooding. This is the big issue in like Miami, right? Where every high tide, suddenly you're seeing water on the streets. So when can we expect things like that in San Diego? On the bottom left there is a plot for La Jolla. It's good for all of San Diego, really. And it's showing that by about the middle of next decade, we're going to start to see the number of days each year of flooding start to ramp up. It's only a few days a year right now. It's going to start to get up to maybe 50 by mid-century. By the end of the century, we'll be looking at nearly every high tide, resulting in a flooding concern under this intermediate scenario. The real issue for San Diego, which is different than Miami, is that our flooding tends to come when we have high waves coinciding with high tides. So this is the winter storm, and even for some of our shorelines, the summer storm conditions. And you can see just how dramatically different the scenario is when you look at the estuary in the background there, which is just going up and down with the tide. And then, of course, the large waves events that rolled in here on Imperial Beach in 2019. So how to start to plan and prepare? Well, better understanding of how this wave component is contributing to the sea level rise problem. We've worked with Imperial Beach to develop an early warning system, which is not only giving you a sense of what's happening next week, but you can start to think about probabilities or scenarios where if sea level were to rise by a certain amount, how often would we see, or would this event have been an extreme event? The model for that, I think, was really successful in that when you start to blend in early warning of today's events with projections of the long-term problem, it really, the public really becomes invested and understands the value of the tool, given the context for today's problem, for today's events. You may have seen an article that just came out saying that we could lose 70% of the beaches in California by the end of the century. That's assuming a very, very high rate rise of sea level of 3 meters, which is even beyond the high level of NOAA range. So but it does give you a sense that, people are starting to look at this. How are our beaches going to survive? Because the beaches really are our #1 defense against sea level rise. Scripps has done a lot in this area. We've been looking since for like 20 years now at how the beaches have been changing in California or San Diego County. And I just wanted to point you to a product that we have, which is an annual beach report for your beach anywhere along the county here. In-depth look at what's been changing, why it's changed, how it's changing relative to El Nino years or storms over the past. And so this is Cardiff, showing that in fact, the beach has widened. There's more sand on the beach since the early 2000s, even in the face of sea level rise. And this is, of course, because there's been active replenishment, nourishment projects going on, whether it be sort of major offshore renourishments or just bypassing at the lagoon. One thing that we're working on, and we think it would be valuable to work on with our community partners, is just to do a little sediment budget now that we have this record. What's coming in, what's going out, how can we predict changes going forward? And in this study, they were asked, how can we hold the line against sea level rise? So with the expected rates going forward for toward the middle of the century, will our current sand management practices be able to maintain a beach, or are we looking at the beach going away? And the good news for us for this beach, which was Cardiff, and I won't go into the details here, just that if you continue doing the annual bypassing that is going on at that beach should continue to grow even through the middle of the century, even with a series of El Nino winters and even with sea level rise. So there's good news there in terms of management practices that can keep pace with some of the changes we're going to see going forward. That report, the other new bit of science that's coming out that is really changing the way we're looking at shorelines is the ability to track shoreline change with satellites. So on the left is a series of images you get from the planet satellite. And on the right is some classification that's used to identify sand and whitewater and whatnot in the images. From that, you can pick out the shoreline. And with this video or a series of images, do a tracking of shoreline change over time. That goes back to the satellites have been up that can be used for this going back to the early 2000s. So we have now records of shoreline change to go with the records that we've been collecting with the in situ work for the entire county. And everywhere you see that it's red there is where the shoreline's retreated. Everywhere it's blue has grown. So the way this is plotted is that time is running from year 2000 to the present along the bottom axis there. And on the top is just moving up along the county from Silver Strand up until to Oceanside. So you might be able to catch by eye that before about 2000, things were somewhat benign, but things seem to get brighter as you go after 2000. We've had 5 years now of unprecedented change along our shoreline, but it's not been consistently changing in the same direction. Some beaches are growing, some beaches are narrowing. There's an interesting oceanographic story to tell there, but we've been looking, for instance, at the, well, you can pick out San Onofre there on the southern end of San Onofre, that blue area. That's an area where the beach has been narrowing considerably. If you move up the coast, you can see the San Clemente area where the rail is having trouble. This product picks that out nicely. So we're getting now a way of tracking change on a very high resolution. And that whole issue of how do you build sediment models to go with this, I think this is the data set that's really going to lead to some significant improvements going forward in that front. So that's the sea level story. Things are going up. Our beaches have been somewhat stable, but we're seeing changes that are starting to get our attention. And we believe that for the next, that we're really going to start to see change in the middle of the decade. And preparing for that, I think, is paramount.
Thank you very much, Dr. Merrifield. Please don't go away. I'm sure we'll have questions and want to have some discussion with you, but let's go ahead and ask Keith to do part B here first. And he's going to present the SANDAG policies that are in place to address the concerns that Dr. Merrifield presented. So Keith.
So you heard about sea level rise and you heard about the uncertainty. It's going to occur, but we're not sure how much, how fast. So how do you deal with this as you're dealing with projects, regional projects? So I'll be discussing some of the policy documents that we take into consideration the uncertainty and adapting to sea level rise in the future. But just kind of as a reinforcement, you know, the problem with sea level rise, it's about combinations. It's when we have high tides, it's when we have storm events, and when we add on top of that, the sea level rise, that's when you start seeing this effect of flooding and erosion that we see on our coastal bluffs and beaches. So in the future, we expect there'll be more flooding, there'll be more coastal erosions, more landslides. So a good glimpse of that will be some of what we have currently with the king tides. You know, king tides are what the non-scientific terms when we have those real extreme events that happen a couple times a year, you know, the 7-foot tides that we have. So if we have, you know, 3, 4, 5 foot, 6 foot of sea level rise, you start seeing this happening much more often. Dr. Merrifield talked about by the end of the century, we'll have 100 days of dramatic flooding occurring. And that means that you're going to affect our communities. We'll have our roads being flooded. We'll have our recreation areas being flooded. We'll have our communities and our sidewalks being flooded. We'll see. There we go. Some of our access to our beaches will be impacted. And it's just not limited to the coastal areas. It's also our communities around the bayfront. We'll see like the Bayshore Bikeway that'll be impacted. And we'll also see, if we're here a little later on by Courtney to present, the trolley in the South Bay will be affected by sea level rise. So what do we do about all that? So there's some guidance documents put out right now by the California Coastal Commission that we use when SANDAG, as an entity that builds our projects, keeps in mind. And you have all worked with the Coastal Commission in the coastal regions, either through your local coastal programs or as a regulatory agency when you're actually trying to independently move through land entitlement process. So these sea level rise policy documents, they take into consideration, the challenges that we face with sea level rise and what do we do about the uncertainty associated with it. It gets some various considerations to take into consideration, such as how much of a risk are you willing to take for the various infrastructures you're improving? Like you might have more risk tolerance for a bike path than you do for a major infrastructure project like a road or a rail line. It also provides various infrastructure development scenarios and case studies. And one of the case studies you'll hear later on by Courtney, we're talking about a recommendation for nature-based adaptation strategies in California to help buffer out some of the issues of sea level rise and create a buffer between our critical infrastructure and the sea itself. So I'm going to give you two examples really quickly of how SANDAG itself is using this as a sea level rise policy adaptation strategy. The two projects I'm giving you is from our Low Sand Railroad. You probably heard the stats. This is the second busiest railroad in the nation. It's our critical lifeline for our goods to move up the coast to other ports and areas in the nation. We've got about 4 million infrastructure moving through there, and we'll have 1 million people using it for commuting. So how do we deal with sea level rise? So our vision for the Low Sand Rail area is to double track the entire area and to replace some of these outdated bridges, which are over 100 years old. So these are two projects which I'm working on currently. The Sereno Valley double track is completed now, and the SANDAG double track is just $100 million to move forward with. And we deal with sea level rise differently on both these scenarios. For the Sereno Valley double track, it's not next to the ocean itself, it's in a lagoon. So we don't have to worry about the wave run up. But we do have to worry about future sea level rise and flooding on top of that. Sereno Valley double track, what we did is we made the pilings that go into to hold the train up adaptable. So something we call adaptive engineering, where they put a big joint on top of it. So in the future, if sea level rise threatens that track, they can physically lift up the track itself, add more pilings to raise the track up above the future sea level rise. In comparison, SANDAG double track is right on the coast. We have to worry about wave run up in that. So we've actually, in proposed plans, we will replace those wooden bridges with concrete pilings, and they will be at a level that we can be certain that the sea level rise will not affect that double track train going forward. It's also not just about infrastructure, it's also some of our restoration projects. So up in the North Coast Corridor area, we've been widening out the freeway as part of our North Coast Corridor Public Works Plan. We have to provide mitigation for the offset the impacts that widening is occurring. And in such, right now, we have a construction project going on to restore wetlands out there in SANDAG. So in this restoration project, it's not all about what current conditions are today, it's about what they could be in the future. So we have to accommodate the plants moving up a transition zone in the future as sea level rise. So that's all part of the thinking and strategies going forward as we move the SANDAG projects through to accommodate sea level rise itself. Now, SANDAG has a long history of policies related to shoreline preservation and climate adaptation, and I'll briefly mention three of those. The preservation strategy for the San Diego region, which was adopted in 1993, the SCOOP program, or Sand Compatibility and Opportunistic Use program, which was adopted in 2006, and finally, in March 2009, we came up with a coastal regional sediment management plan. Real quick, the shoreline preservation strategy is a dated document, but at the time was adopted by the board resolution, and it envisioned that beach nourishment would be the strategy for shoreline preservation. Meaning if you have sand on the beach, it is a buffer for a rising sea. And some of these beach efforts that you've heard about that are growing are results of SANDAG's efforts with the regional partners to create 2 regional beach sand projects out in the region. The strategy envisioned we'd have one big push for sand, 30 million cubic yards we placed in the region initially. And then every year after, it'd be about 400,000 cubic yards of sand. So it was kind of the shock and awe of sand. Put a lot out once, and then every year monitor it and fill in the gaps where needed, where it's eroding. Now, fast forward, that's never happened. That's about an order of magnitude greater than we've ever placed sand in the region. So in regional beach sand 1 and 2, a combination, we only put 3 million cubic yards out there. So this document needs to be revised. It needs to be updated based upon our monitoring efforts that we've had going on since 1996. Our lessons learned from 2 regional beach sand projects, and our greater understanding right now of kind of our regional sinks and sources of sand in the littoral cell. The next document really quickly, it was a sand compatible and opportunistic use program, or SCOOP. It's easier to say SCOOP. So the region said local jurisdictions have the opportunity sometimes to get sand on an opportunistic basis. You might be digging a parking garage in the coastal zone. You've got good beach quality sand, or some other sources of sand may come out from development. And they needed a simple process to put that sand on the beach. SANDAG stepped up, created this SCOOP permit, a SCOOP plan, and jurisdictions got permits to actually be able to put sand on the beach when the opportunity arose. Now, this document was very successful, but some of those permits have expired. And going forward, we need to actually consider adopting one regional SCOOP permit as opposed to 8 different permits, and explore some restrictions that are currently in the SCOOPs, like the sand size, how much sand size you can use, the minimums, and if we can eliminate some of the monitoring that's going on, which probably has shown that nothing's occurred out in the regions in terms of impacts. And finally, I would just like to mention the last document, the Coastal Regional Sand Management Plan. This was a real deep look at all the littoral cells, where the sand sources are, both inland sources and coastal sources, and where the beaches were eroding that could use sand. So this effort kind of modified some of the preservation strategies in the 1993 document. And it said there's probably a better way of doing this. And it did get into a little bit about sediment retention devices or sand retention devices, but it said you should pilot those out. So where are we headed with all these documents? Some of them are quite dated. So in September, we'll be bringing to the working group a work plan for your next year. And as part of that work plan, we're going to be talking about possibly review and updating these documents and taking all that updated information and putting it in the 2025 regional plan, which SANDAG started to work on. So that regional plan is kind of like a general plan for your cities that kind of guides the future development. And as part of that plan, we have a sustainable community strategy, and shoreline preservation is one of the community strategies, one of the preservation strategies we need to conclude in that. We'll also be bringing to the working group other things such as nourishment, beach nourishment efforts that are possibly going on for the Regional Beach Sand 3 project, and finally, other nature-based climate solutions. So that's where we're headed with these policy documents. And I'll stop there and turn it over to the chair to we can address any questions.
All right. Thank you, Keith. Let's see if we have any public comment first, and then we'll open it to the panel on questions and comments. Do we have any public comment on this item, Tessa?
Thank you, Chair. I have one public comment from Catherine Rhodes. Please come to the podium.
Catherine, welcome back.
Lovely. So anyway, Catherine Rhodes, beach nourishment is just feeding the beach. You have to feed the beach. Dr. Inman always in his books would say you have to feed the river and you have to feed the beach, the sand. And if you do my La Playa plan, you'll actually get sand to put on your beaches. For example, if you do an airport connectivity plan and it's going to be underground and you're going to go down, probably 30 or 40 feet, you could build a corridor and you'll have to do something with the sand. So anyway, it's kind of like the Boring Company where they used their natural resources that we don't do here in San Diego. So anyway, I have a big, huge problem with the Port of San Diego because the old Port of San Diego master plan from 1963, when it was formed till about 2005, required every project to have at least 2 levels of underground parking. 2 levels. What that would do, it had 2 wonderful things. The first thing that it did is it got rid of the seismic hazard of liquefaction. The second thing it did is it creates bathtub foundations. And so what's an example of a bathtub foundation? The main one that I always thought was so great is the World Trade Center built, in the middle of the river with transit underneath. And then the second building that was created with the bathtub foundation was a county administration center. So in 1930, they knew to go at least 2 levels underground. So you don't build on shifting sands, and I always bring up the Bible where, it talks about the Matthew 7:24-27, where I'll just read it. If you hear these words of mine, I liken them to a wise man who builds his house on a rock. The rain came down, the floods came, the winds blew, it beat the house and it didn't fall, for it was founded on a rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't do them is a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on the house and it fell and was a great fall. We build on shifting sands in the city of San Diego. And a perfect horrible example of the the lack of engineering or the lack of acknowledgement is Midway rising. If you go to the city of San Diego, they said, oh, we have all these adaptions. I actually looked through their adaptions. Their adaptions are porous pavements. Porous pavements is their adaptation for sea level rise. The adaptation for sea level rise is cisterns, underground cisterns that they used in, Jesus's time. This is what they do in other countries around all around the world. In San Diego, we don't do that. We have our public lands owned by us, the people of the state of California, with our guidelines on the port. And so if the port could change their master or their plans and say 2 levels.
Thank you.
underground,
Your
that
time
would be great.
expired.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Tessa, do we have somebody on the line that wanted to comment too?
We do, Chair, but I have one more in-person public commenter, Julie Chen here. Please come to the podium. And then I do have one virtual commenter to follow.
Right.
Good afternoon, Julia Chen here with Coastal Consulting California. Sometimes when we hear about the uncertainty, it's tempting to want to wait and see how things go. I just want to urge and encourage most of these coastal cities like Imperial Beach and Del Mar. I know it takes a long time to plan for these changes, to implement, to get public buy-in. And the longer we wait, sometimes we have less desirable options available. And anytime we wait till there's an emergency and have to rely on hard structures, that can usually exacerbate erosion elsewhere. So just a strong reminder to engage early and often and not wait until we have the certainty, because these changes take a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And I would just note for the record, she was a longtime member of the Shoreline Working Group several years ago. And we have one more speaker.
Is there one? Yes, Chair. Our final speaker on this is virtual. Gilson, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Lynn Gilson, and I just wanted to say, one, I appreciate Dr. Merrifield's presentation and its conclusion that we could keep up with sea level rise with the sand replenishment projects. This has been a theme that I've seen in other presentations that were SANDAG presentations over the last couple of years here. And so it's good to see that confirmed. And so that begs the question to Mr. Greer about where we are in that next regional sand replenishment project, because all the presentations I've seen previously have kind of summarized as, we should be doing this every 10 years at least, and that there's usually a 5-year ramp up. The last one was, I guess, 2011. So at this point, we're kind of 6 or 7 years behind schedule. Last time Mr. Greer gave an update, he said that a few cities weren't on board, but didn't mention which cities those were. So could you kind of tell us where we are with that? Thank you.
Keith, you want to go ahead and respond to that? Might as well. Somebody else is going to ask it of you anyway.
Sure, and without stealing Courtney's thunder, she's going to address that exact issue in the next presentation.
All right,
I'll say right now that we're on a good approach to doing an original beach sand project.
All right, Tessa, does that complete our public comments?
That concludes the public comments.
All right, let's open the floor at this point to the members of the panel. If you have questions or comments, and I would note we've heard from Dr. Merrifield what's coming our way, which is pretty sobering. We've heard from Keith what the policies are that are in place, and we haven't yet heard, but we will, what we're planning to do about it. So Mayor Aguirre, you want to make a comment?
Yes, thank you. Just a quick one. We're very thankful to Dr. Merrifield and his team for the partnership, especially as it comes to the IB flood alert system. I just wanted to share the practical applications of that. In the past, we had a combination of the king tide and a storm event, and we had something close to $10,000 to $12,000 in damage because of the flooding, because we weren't ready. And this time around, we had a combination of both, but we were ready for it. So we had all of our staff ready to take action, and we did some proactive actions, and we didn't have nearly as much damage as we did in the first one. And I think that's good for us to think expanding it regionally. And in terms of the data that you showed for the predicted flood day events, right? Increasing up to 100 days in 2030, that's pretty terrifying. And I know that at least at the Coastal Commission, we've approved I think a record number of emergency coastal permits related to the coastal erosion because of all the atmospheric rivers that we've had. So definitely something to encourage all of our colleagues here to start thinking about expanding that program. Thank you.
All right, thanks for sharing that. Anybody else? Yes, sir, Dr. Flick.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, thanks, Mark and Keith, for the overview of that. Mark, can you discuss a little bit and tell us a little bit about the support, the financial support from the state and from the feds that I know about? There may be others I don't know about. And the, I don't want to call it precarious, but year to year uncertainty in that, and maybe go out on a limb and suggest how the SANDAG and the local agencies might help here?
I think Ron's talking about the 20 years of record that's been acquired by Scripps was done with very generous support from the Army Corps and also state of California through Department of Boating and Waterways, and now through the Department of Parks and Recreation. So we've had strong federal and state partners, and as Mayor Guire said, we're also working more on the municipal level. But I think it's precarious. You know, it's a year-to-year sort of thing. I mean, we go from budget to budget, and it's we've certainly appreciated the support of SANDAG when we have needed to show why the work is useful. We've gotten nice letters of support in the past. But, and I'm also including here the offshore wave buoy network, the CDIP wave buoys, which a lot of you are familiar with. Yeah, Ron's right. I think it takes a lot of effort to keep that going. And the more support we get from agencies like SANDAG, the more we'll be able to continue this research.
Thank you. Keith, did you want to comment on that? Your money bags, right?
Well, I'll give you an analogy of how we're doing the current beach nourishment efforts and some of the monitoring. It's like waiting 10, 12 years and collecting your money up, scraping the cushions, asking mom and dad, and then going to the dentist. The dentist finds a whole bunch of cavities and the whole bunch, you know, a lot of dental repair work. And then you wait another 10 to 12 years. And you need to get more regular, you know, you go to the dentist. I tell my kids, go to the dentist every year, you know, fix your teeth. But that's how we're doing it currently. And I think what you were alluding to, Chair, before is how do we change that to more cycle, get on a cycle? And that's where the Army Corps of Engineers is coming down. They're putting sand on the beach. Thank you to Encinitas and Solana Beach for your efforts. How do we expand that program? And I think that's going to be a discussion we have with the working group in the future, is how do we take a next nourishment project, but piggyback on existing efforts?
All right, thank you. Other questions, comments, anybody? Yes.
Thank you, Chair. I really want to just say thank you for the nature-based solutions part of what you presented, Keith. And I know it was just kind of mentioned, but I think it's like the overarching objective. So in saying that, I have a question for Dr. Merrifield. You mentioned the Cardiff Beach Dune Restoration Project, and I was so happy to hear that there's an annual report that acknowledges how the beaches are evolving. Can you speak to, and I can look at it in more detail, but could you speak to how the shoreline dune creation in Cardiff has influenced the preservation of sand in that stretch of the beach?
Yes. So if you've had a look at it lately, you know that in January, I believe this year, it took a beating. It's a steep scarp in front of that. And there was a lot of concern that the dune had sort of failed in some way, but in fact, it worked like a charm. So it did exactly what it was supposed to do. And not only did it provide protection to the road, but it also, in the calculations that we did on that sediment budget, it supplied sand from the upper beach to the lower beach that was sort of crucial in maintaining the beach width. So it's sort of a store of sand that when it's needed, it replenishes the beach and somewhat naturally. So that system is, I think, very successful. Part of the reason I said we could maintain the beach there is largely due to the bypassing, but also due to the sand deposits that are kept on that upper dune. So a very successful project, and we're continuing to monitor the benefits of that going forward.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. I think there's an opportunity to learn from that section of the beach and how it might be applied to other areas along the shoreline. And just from my own perspective, the Regional Sustainable Communities Working Group, I believe would be interested in hearing some more detail on that.
Anybody else? Yes, let's go down here.
I'm Darren with California State Parks, and just I'm holding it down. Sorry, I'm on walkie-talkie mode. So anyway, we've learned so much from SANDAG and the reports and all the work that's been putting that in scripts. One of the things I'd like to see going forwards with the task force and everything else is some better regional coordination with the sand bypass efforts. And I think there's a lot of room there. We've all sort of recognized how important those are to beach sand around there, but looking as a region, how to coordinate those and optimize them so we're using the sand in the best way. Also coordinating some of the monitoring and some of the constraints, grunion and things like that, and working together kind of as a county so that all those things have a structure and hopefully there's some cost savings when we're getting to do that. So that's something I'd really like to work on.
Thank you for that comment. And that's exactly a top priority for the Shoreline Working Group. The sand moves regionally and we've got to address it regionally. Who else would like to comment? Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for the presentations. I have kind of a brief technical question, not to get too geeky, but Keith, in your presentation, you talked about the low sand track projects and about having the bridges be able to raise and lower. So I'm just curious. So would that just be, you'd have to suspend service for a while when there's like a flooding scare, or you'd raise the tracks? Would that be the approach? Or
so just like we do today, where we want to replace those bridge, you have service either an absolute work window where service is not occurring during that time frame, or you put it on one track as you're working on the other track, or you're building the other track. So it's a kind of common practice that's done. In the case that's different here is you already have the steel pipes that are in the ground, so you don't have to put those pipes in. You just have to add to them. And that's kind of the unique adaptation there, where you're thinking ahead. If you have to add to it, instead of redoing the whole thing, you just kind of like a Legos, you just add more Legos and stack it up.
Right, but you can't use those tracks, right? I mean, you couldn't connect it to the track coming from the land.
So you can run right now, you can run double track, right? So you can run trains on one of the tracks and work on the other one, and then raise that one up, and then shift the trains on the track you just raised up and work on the other one. So you're doing a parallel working. Does that make sense? We can talk about it afterwards.
Yeah, maybe I'll check in with you.
Please do.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Hinsey.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious to have a little bit more information about the pilots that have been suggested as part of the plan going forward. SANDAG has played a really important role in the regional beach sand programs as well as SCOOP. And so I'm curious to know, will it still fall on the individual cities to say, we want to plan, design, fund a retention device or strategy, or will SANDAG take a bigger role in that? And if you do need a bigger role in that, where would you get the authority to be able to do that?
Those are fabulous questions. Where we're at right now in SANDAG is trying to move forward with the Regional Beach Sand 3 project. So that's more sand that we've done past 2 times. What you're bringing up is retention devices and holding the sand in place. We don't have right now any projects proposed for that. I mentioned the document that we currently have, which is the Regional Comprehensive Sand Management Plan, which suggests if there was a desire to have devices, it doesn't say that is needed. If there's a desire, that it should be piloted out first and not just done and then walked away from. So it's saying if you're going to do something that's removable. That's all in a policy. There's no current projects moving forward with any kind of pilot right now.
On that, the RBSP3, as we call it, Regional Beach Sand Project 3, its protocol has in it a potential pilot program. So we're hoping that we could include that in it. Who else? Comments, questions? Yes, sir, Eric.
Thank you so much for the presentation and all the information. I wanted to bring up that I sort of looked into the documents, specifically, which one? The one from 2009 that just listed the optimal amount of sand to be replenished to be 1 million to 500,000 per year. The 10-year going to the dentist metaphor is really interesting to me. I think given the first presentation and the second presentation, a lot of our coastal cities aren't going to be going to the dentist. They're going to be getting their teeth knocked out. And we really need the urgency of this body to move something forward that's got a plan that's going to really make a difference. So I appreciate the contemplation and I appreciate the seriousness by which we take this, and looking forward to see what the group comes up with.
All right, thank you. Anybody else? Not, I have a couple myself. We mentioned in a perfect world, 30 million yards is what we should put on the beach. I know we've got sand trapped in our reservoirs by accident, but there it is. We've got sand trapped in our lagoons by accident, there it is. And we've got offshore sand. Dr. Merrifield, is there enough supply in our region to do a replenishment program for the long term?
I'm looking at Ron.
Import it from Hawaii. Yeah, that's a great idea. Get some nice white sand. Yeah, that's a good question. Probably, for a few of those, there's probably enough offshore in certain places, not everywhere off the coast. There were surveys done back in the 60s that the state sponsored for exactly this reason, for this question. And there are more recent surveys by, what's his name from Scripps? Done surveys offshore. I can't remember his name offhand. Driscoll, yeah, Neil Driscoll, yeah, Professor Driscoll. But this is, I'm gonna shift the subject here a little bit. This is something where SANDAG could become involved, and by that I mean with dollar signs. To actually further the research for that. I mean, that's a research question. It's an offshore, it's not really a research, it's an offshore exploration question. The technology for that exists. It's not that expensive, as these things go, to do these offshore surveys and sand samples to find out, where that, not just how much, but where it is.
Thank you. I will take note of that as chair of the Shoreline Working Group. I think that's a great suggestion. And in case anybody hasn't figured it out, Dr. Reinhold Flick is with Scripps Institute and is a longtime researcher in this field. One other question from me for Dr. Merrifield or Keith, whoever wants to take it on. I understood you to say sand replenishment can work as a strategy probably through roughly mid-century, maybe 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise. What do we do when we pass that threshold? What are the options when sand replenishment no longer works?
We're looking at each other because that's the fundamental question for the entire world right now. What do we do when these adaptation strategies are just not enough? And I think we're all going to be crossing that same barrier, talking mid-century. But right now, if ice is the big question about sea level rise, sand is the solution that we need to do in the near term. And that's about as best as we can answer. At least I'm willing to go. Dr. Merrifield?
Yeah, I think it's the way we call that all of these solutions are short term. There's nothing here that's a magic solution, and it really redoubles our effort, I think, to really mitigate against these future scenarios. So we're buying time in hopes that we can bend that curve down, so we're not faced with these dramatic sea level rise. We still have a chance to avoid the worst of what I showed there. So short-term solutions, I think we've got some things that we can turn to. In the long term, we're trying to bring the curve down.
All right, final chance, questions before we go on to the next part of the presentation. We'll open it up again for more comments then. So Courtney Pessy, you're up.
Thank you, Chair. Situated. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Courtney Pesh, if you don't already know who I am. I am a regional planner here at SANDAG, but I also am the project manager for the shoreline management and monitoring program here. Today, I'm going to be discussing how the San Diego region is adapting to sea level rise through implementation and planning projects. First, I'll provide a brief history of SANDAG's involvement. Then I will be providing some examples of some resiliency and adaptation projects being completed throughout the region. And lastly, what are our region's next steps? So as Chair Warden had mentioned earlier, my fun fact for this slide was that the oldest and longest standing working group here at SANDAG is the Shoreline Preservation Working Group, which was established in the 1980s, which amazing 40 years. The working group consists of all coastal jurisdiction elected officials, as you see sitting here today, with a representative also from the Navy and the Port of San Diego. Essentially, anyone who's concerned with making sure our beaches are not eroding. We added to that group about 5 years ago the port cities, that being the cities of National City and Chula Vista, as they aren't necessarily concerned with their coastlines eroding, but more so how sea level rise is impacting their port areas. Additionally, we are supported by advisory members, which you will also see here sitting today, like State Parks, Scripps Institute of Oceanography, California Coastal Commission, and a slew of others who are all concerned with how do we maintain our beaches and sustain the enjoyment for our visitors, our residents, and future visitors to come. The Shoreline Preservation Working Group's role and purpose is to recommend to the Board of Directors policy documents pertaining to shoreline protection and preservation, which you just learned, that as Keith and Dr. Mark Merrifield went through, what some of those policy documents look like. But one notable program that I really want to emphasize is the Regional Shoreline Monitoring Program. This program is funded by the coastal jurisdictions and many of that you see sitting here today to perform biannual shoreline monitoring and surveys to measure beach width change over time. Coastal Frontiers, who has been our consultant for the past 27 years, has collected data which is vital and extremely helpful when looking at historical beach width change over time seasonally and by year to year. Their findings are then compiled into an annual report that then is presented to the Shoreline Preservation Working Group generally each fall. And now that I just discussed what SANDAG has done in the past for adaptation planning, what has the region done to support coastal adaptation planning? The San Diego Climate Collaborative is currently finalizing their coastal resiliency roadmap. This roadmap work is focused on how we can elevate existing work happening and occurring in the region that are focused on specific goals and principles on a regional basis. Concurrently, the city of San Diego is creating their coastal resilience master plan. Their master plan implements their climate resilient San Diego and will build upon resilience to avoid impacts to sea level rise, while also enhancing and protecting the biodiversity of the city's coastline. And if you want to learn more about both of these projects, we have invited the City of San Diego and the Climate Collaborative to a future Shoreline Preservation Working Group meeting to dive deeper and tell us about these awesome planning projects. But SANDAG too has completed adaptation projects in the past 5 years. Back in 2017, SANDAG prepared the adaptation guidance document, which analyzes potential sea level rise impacts to our transportation facilities here in San Diego. And what I mean by transportation facilities, I don't just mean rail. I also mean highways and also active transportation routes being bikeways and trails. As you look to the slide above, you'll see that there's a table excerpt that was taken directly from the adaptation guidance. And I won't go too far into detail, but basically, this is a great example showing how the Blue Line trolley in National City will be impacted in almost every sea level rise scenario proposed, which this is extremely important and vital information for our stakeholders to know in order to adapt for the current challenges we're facing, but also the future challenges we will be facing. So now I just finished describing all these types of coastal planning projects. And I want to now pose the question that I'm sure you all have, and it's burning, as Keith mentioned earlier. What are nature-based climate solutions and why are they important? Well, it's because of the California's 30 by 30 plan. This plan commits California to conserving 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030 and aims to adopt a nature-based solution approach that focuses on protecting our biodiversity and providing equitable access to nature for all Californians. And now that was a mouthful, so essentially, this is saying that California's goal is to implement projects that mimic nature to adapt to sea level rise and climate change, rather than proposing and implementing projects that focus on hard structures or temporary solutions. And as we saw earlier, what better example of a nature-based climate solution project than the Cardiff Living Shoreline that was completed in 2019. Prior to that, the city of Encinitas was facing many challenges with this stretch of Cardiff State Beach. And as you see in the images, you see daily flooding, potentially poor beach quality, and beach erosion. San Diego is known worldwide for its beautiful, sandy, diverse beaches, not rock cobble beaches. So how did the city tackle this multifaceted problem? By restoring a historic dune system on top of a buried rock revetment that's intended to provide multiple benefits to the community and to the environment. This project beautified, protected, and conserved the habitat along this stretch of the beach and provided new walking and biking opportunities that had never existed prior. And as you look to these images, it looks quite beautiful. It's very natural looking on the outside, but what lies underneath that you aren't able to see is a specifically engineered rock revetment that it provides adequate protection for the coastline and Coastal Highway 101 from significant wave damage and energy. Another great example project that is still currently being implemented is the City of Imperial Beach's Bayshore to Bikeway Resilience Project. This project aims to repurpose a 1.2 segment of the San Diego Bayshore Bikeway corridor into a multi-benefit coastal resilience corridor. It will not only just provide flood protection for the bikeway, but it will also provide flood protection for the surrounding vulnerable community. One of the main drivers for this project is the consistent and historic flooding of the bikeway. And as you look to the screen, you'll see photos dating as far back as 2015 on this segment of the Flamingo Trail along the Bayshore Bikeway. And as you can see, it's not accessible. The city of Imperial Beach wanted to tackle this in an adaptive way. So they not only wanted to look at areas where the city is currently experiencing flooding, but they also wanted to look at areas where there's projections for future sea level rise in years to come. And I won't go too far into detail on this project, but I just wanted to point out all of the light blue areas shows where the city is actively experiencing flooding currently, today, like in the images you just saw prior. The dark blue areas illustrate where projected sea level rise will be. And as you see, that encompasses an enlarged amount of the city. So if we know the community at large is going to be impacted, how do we address this in a nature-based way? Well, the city's project concept proposed to implement a living levee that will function like a traditional levee, but it will provide multiple benefits for the habitat to allow space for it to transition over time as water levels rise. And in this particular area, it's a salt marsh habitat. So the concept is to gradient the salt marsh so it can slowly creep its way up the slope as the sea levels begin to rise. So it will not impact walkways or bikeways. Finally, the last type of nature-based climate solution I want to talk about today is beach nourishment, which seems to be the pressing topic. Beach nourishment is a regularly used practice, especially where I'm from. I'm from Connecticut, back on the East Coast, and it was a normal sight to see every single summer and spring, bulldozers on the beach pushing the sand right back on. If you can imagine, a hurricane comes every fall, it hits the coastline, it wipes all of the sand off the beach. But then every spring and the summer, the states and the East Coast work intimately with the Army Corps of Engineers to put that sand back onto the beach. Here on the West Coast, that's not as common of a practice, but SANDAG has completed 2 regional beach sand efforts. This is where we went outside the depth of closure with a massive dredge, literally scooped the sand off the ocean floor and pumped it back onto our beaches. And as you can see in that video, that bulldozer is actually flattening out the freshly pumped sand. And this is generally how San Diego's has been maintaining our beaches thus far. Again, not on a regular routine maintenance like as you heard what the East Coast does, but more when we had the availability to do it. And that being the funding. The first regional beach sand project was completed in 2001, and it placed 2.2 million cubic yards of sand on 12 beaches and 7 coastal cities in San Diego, generally costing about $18 million. Regional Beach Sand Project 2 was then completed 12 years later, and that's where it was smaller in scale as it only placed 1.4 million cubic yards of sand on, let me get this right, 8 beaches and 5 coastal cities. But because of inflation, the price did increase to about $26 million. And again, we consider these one-off projects because they were not performed routinely or on a regular cycle or decided upon, but more so when funding became available for the West Coast. So since it's been over 10 years since the last regional beach sand project, the need has arose to initiate another regional approach, being Regional Beach Sand Project 3. Regarding Regional Beach Sand Project 3, SANDAG developed 3 phases, as you see on the screen above, mirroring Regional Beach Sand Project 2 and converted the costs from Regional Beach Sand Project 2 into today's dollars. So starting from left to right, phase 1 is to perform the preliminary planning activities. This is where we need to determine what would be the best approach, not only economically, but also for recreation and for resiliency against sea level rise. It's estimated this phase will cost about $200,000. Phase 2 will then be focusing on obtaining the environmental clearances and permits, and this phase is estimated to cost about $3 million. And lastly, phase 3 is the project's implementation, which is the construction and post-monitoring survey. And I know it's not that much of a surprise to know that this is the costliest phase, estimated at around $37 million. And now I want to get to the burning question you all are wondering is, where are we with this timeline for Regional Beach Sand Project 3? Well, earlier this year, almost all of the coastal jurisdictions brought their individual draft MOUs to their city council for discussion and successfully approved. We are still pending on one more city, that being the city of San Diego, to bring their draft MOU to their council for discussion. Now, SANDAG is now currently working on executing these individual MOUs with the cities and expect to hire one of our on-call consultants to perform the preliminary planning activities. We anticipate we will have our consultant hired and identified before the end of the summer. Afterwards, we expect that it will take the consultant about 12 months to complete the phase 1 preliminary planning activities. And after phase 1 is completed, it's SANDAG's intention and goal to apply our phase 1 findings to future state and federal grant opportunities to fund the remainder of the project, being the costliest phases 2 and 3. SANDAG will continue to provide updates to our shoreline preservation working group throughout phase 1 during that 12-month period, so everyone is on board with the process and the progress of that. And with that, that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, and my contact information is on the screen above. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. And let's see if we have any public comment, and then we'll bring it back to the group here for questions and comments. Any public want to speak to us, Tessa?
Thank you. I currently have 3 in-person and 1 virtual public commenter. The first is Garth Nagel. Please come to the podium.
Good afternoon. My name is Garth Nagel. I'm a senior planner with the Department of Navy, 750 Pacific Highway. Excuse me. So I primarily focus on master planning, and I just really was intending to attend this as kind of a fly on the wall, but I thought I'd take the opportunity to make a brief comment. So the Department of Defense has a climate action plan, and the Navy has a climate action plan, and both of those really emphasize partnering with other agencies and institutions to address climate change. The Navy Region Southwest has previously partnered and collaborated with the Port of San Diego, Scripps Institute of Oceanography, had an opportunity to work with Dr. Merrifield in the past, some of the other agencies, San Diego Climate Collaborative that Courtney mentioned. And actually very recently, we collaborated with SANDAG on the Military Installation Resilience Project. And that particular project looked at both nature-based solutions as well as a little bit more traditional civil projects. So not really a question. I just really wanted to emphasize that really looking forward to continued participation and attendance at these joint sessions. I think, looking at the regional planning, kind of the planning aspect, as well as the shoreline preservation on this important topic is going to be critical. So I applaud this entire group for your efforts, and thank you. Over.
Thank you for your comments. I believe we have military representation on the Shoreline Working Group, but you would also be welcome to attend any of our meetings. We'd be happy to see you there. Who's our next speaker, Testa?
Our next speaker, Dr. Timothy Bilaashka, who will be followed by Catherine Rhodes.
Good afternoon again, committee, joint committee. I'm Bilaashka up in the Del Mar area on the coast. I lived in Atlantic coast. I've been everywhere in the country at one time or another. In Florida, it used to be at 3 p.m., it would rain for about 15 minutes, I don't know, half an inch of rain. And then it would clear up by 4 p.m. You didn't even know it rained. There's a circulation in the Atlantic Ocean I'm aware of that isn't there now. There are really big changes, and sometimes we look at the results of the problem and maybe don't see the problem. So we see the sand on the ocean that we sit in and where we swim, but we don't look up at the air, and we don't look down deep into the soil. And I don't know about you, my head hurts right now from all this stuff. I mentioned the word sinkholes. Escondido has a huge sinkhole by the 78 that closed the route. I think it's open now. And I'd like to tell this story because it's really dramatic. Down on the Tampa Bay Bayway 30 years ago, they had 130 columns, and one night, 80 of them collapsed. They had sinkholes in the ground that they didn't predict. I don't know if they predicted the sinkhole in Escondido, but we're talking about moving sand on the surface, but we're not looking underneath at the erosion that's taking place and the caverns that are being formed and the collapses that have already happened here over time. And so I make a plea about sinkholes to look at water. And it's a part of the climate problem I really wasn't that aware of until this year. I've been trying to learn a lot about it, but the need for soil regeneration. And that means that there are microorganisms in the ground related to fungi which absorb water and store it in the ground, huge amounts, and they help replenish the plants and nourish them above in very delicate, complicated cycles. And nobody is studying it except a few farmers connected around the world who are doing sustainable farming. And so I make a plea to not just look at the sand, but to look up into the air at the particulate matter, which is collecting the water that's coming out of the, not going into the ground, too much above and too little below, so that it comes down all at once and washes us away and the coast into the ocean. And so it's like a cycle that the water's going in the opposite direction. This microbiome in the ground is an area that I would urge needs some real good study and funding. So please go in that direction to help. Thank you.
Thank you for your input. And I believe we have one more speaker, Tessa.
We have one more in-person speaker who will be followed by our final virtual speaker, Gilson.
Right.
Catherine Rhodes.
Hi, I wanted to talk about one of my favorite books. It's 2 Years Before the Mast. That really got me interested in California history. And basically what it shows was all the missions. What they did for money is that they had cows and they sold the hides. And so back, before California became a state, 2 years before the Mast talks about how when they would come into San Diego Bay, they would have to stop and they would have to get off on La Playa, which is called the beach in Spanish. And that's my former beautiful, lovely neighborhood of La Playa. And what I really liked about, doing that and looking at all that history was that, in 1850, the Army Corps of Engineers came. And what they did is they started dredging San Diego Bay and for the boats, because previously, the boats could only go to La Playa. And then you had to go down the La Playa Trail to Old Town. And, La Playa and Old Town were both established in 1849, the year before California became a state in 1850. So anyway, what we have is we have all the sand you need, you've got. It was in the bay, now it's created shifting sands on land, and you could actually use it. It's yours, it's free. It's a resource, a natural resource. So anyway, my La Playa plan actually has a solution for the blue line. My solution is the same solution that you could use potentially for the airport connectivity project. And what that is a series of corridors, I'd say 40 feet by 40 feet that goes down. And then what it does is it future-proofs against sea level rise. It literally does. And so what you would do with the spoils is you would put them on the sand. So anyway, in our Mission Bay littoral cell, we need so much help. Specifically for me, I live on the boardwalk in PB, and right in front of Diamond Street, the people to the north of us, they have a little sand dune. So they get that sand dune that gives protection to their cliffs. But for us, we don't get any little sand dunes. So I would request that who's ever in charge of doing the sand dunes, I have no clue who it is, maybe it's the city of San Diego, they actually do it for the place where it's needed the most. So anyway, and I love the dunes. I think that's the perfect solution. So anyway, one of the other things is the U.S. bulkhead elevation was established in 1850 and has never changed. So when you do all these different things, I would like you to recreate and establish a new U.S. bulkhead elevation that we could all build to. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker is Gilson. Please go ahead.
Hi, yeah, Dr. Gilson here again. I'm still kind of looking for that answer from SANDAG on that actual timeline. Yeah, you're still in phase 1, which astoundingly is just to raise $200,000. That's a rounding error in many budgets. And we're in our 2nd year of trying to get out of phase 1. And there's still one city that hasn't put in their money. I really don't understand. But more importantly, you didn't show us the end point of that timeline. When would you actually do the sand replenishment on the timeline that you're currently running? So, we need that just to be put out there. And it's unfortunate, I've been coming to these meetings for over 2 years now, and the scientific presentations have been astoundingly good, and I cannot thank you enough. But at every meeting, somebody asks, why some of these things have become politicized, why couldn't we just take care of our beaches in a more regular basis? And the answer never comes up. And, nobody dares answer it. But the fact is that, these sand replenishment projects are political. And we really do need to address that question. You know, and it happened to be that my last mayor, the mayor of Encinitas, while she was mayor, was also the chairperson of SANDAG, and said that she was not going to support those sand replenishment projects until she beat a few homeowners, blufftop homeowners, into submission. And, you know, this hasn't put our beaches in jeopardy. And the Solana Beach Encinitas project, Army Corps of Engineers, that only takes care of the southern part of Encinitas. And so, you know, again, a bit of a misnomer in its name. But what is the real timeline? And can somebody tell us how to prevent this from becoming a political football again in the future? Thank you.
Thank you for your input. Let me toss that to Keith or Courtney. As to the timeline part of it, can you tell us when we might actually see sand on the beaches?
Yeah, to address that, I don't think it's a political football. I think it's a financial football. So if you can get $40 million tomorrow, we could start doing the work. How do you get $40 million? It's not as easy as we'd hoped for. So we have this study, the phase 1 study for planning and feasibility is going on. Thank you, jurisdictions, for contributing to that and paying for it. Now, within a year, we wanted to do 2 things. One is to talk to the Army Corps about taking their current project in Solana Beach and part of Encinitas and expanding that. What does it take? And I think I know the answer to that already. What it's going to take is some help, political help, to have that a priority for the federal government to expand that program. That's the conversation we're going to have with the working group over this next year. The answer beyond all that is we do not know. We do not know when we're going to get $40 million to do a regional beach sand project.
All right, thank you, Keith. That's an honest, if sobering answer. All right, I think no more speakers, right?
That concludes the public comments.
We are trying to conclude at 2:30, but we can stay an extra 5 or 10 minutes if people want to, if you want to have discussions and questions. So let's open the floor. Who's got a question or a comment? Mayor Aguirre.
Thank you, Chair. Quick question. So I recently met with some higher level officials from NOAA, and they were telling me that there's some readily available funding for coastal resiliency projects immediately through the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill. Is that something that you guys are looking at? Because my understanding is they already opened that request for proposals. So maybe that could be an option if you haven't looked at that.
We were made aware of this, and we're definitely going to be looking into almost any possible opportunity that's coming our way in the coming months and year that we will be executing this phase 1. Again, it's our goal to then use the findings from phase 1, because in the past, when we've applied to different grant opportunities to fund us to begin another regional approach, we were unsuccessful, being told that a planning project is not as competitive. But now that we graciously have funding from our coastal cities to pay for the phase 1, we can then take those findings so we can be a more competitive application for these coastal resiliency grant opportunities.
All right, anybody else? Questions, comments? Yes, ma'am.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kanani Leslie, Coastal Commission staff. Thank you, Courtney, for the presentation. I just wanted to note for the examples of coastal adaptation planning projects, one project that's currently in the planning phases is the City of Carlsbad project with the Coastal Conservancy to realign Carlsbad Boulevard further inland and allow for the revetment of that protects Encinitas Creek and the beach to be removed so that the beach can naturally erode and that the wetland habitat can increase there in that location. So I think that would be a great project for this group to track as well.
Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else? A couple of comments from me then while you're thinking if there's anything else. Number one, simple. Are the slides that we saw today going to be available on the website, and where can people find them if they want to see them?
Yes, they absolutely will. And I will be sending out an email to all of the Shoreline Preservation Working Group, and I believe the clerk of the board will also be providing this to the Regional Planning Committee after today's meeting concludes. But they're also on our website. If you go to either to the name of the working group or Regional Planning Committee's page, or by accessing it through the calendar function as well.
Right. Second, just as part of the fun factor of being on the Shoreline Committee, we did do field trips both to the Cardiff Living Dune Project and to Imperial Beach before COVID shut us down. So come on down to some of our meetings and hop on the bus with us when we go around and look at things. Next, I'm glad that Kanani is here from the Coastal Commission because I wanted to just briefly mention they're obviously a key player in this, and I'm going to summarize what I understand their key takeaway is, and she can correct me if I get any of it wrong. Their guidance on how to do sea level rise planning says it's a local decision how you want to do it, but they require you to study 4 options. Option 1 is armoring, seawalls, riprap, hard solutions. Option 2 is nature-based solutions, could be dune fields, could be oyster beds, could be living levees. Option 3 is managed retreat, and that's the controversial one, pulling back. And option 4 is a hybrid of the above 3. And often that, which to me is a pretty sensible, those are the options. And they're saying, we expect you to study them, but it's a local decision how you're going to choose to implement them. And sometimes that gets lost and swallowed up by the panic over the concept of managed retreat. But so, Kanani, did I get any of that wrong? Please correct me if I did.
No, I think you framed it pretty well.
All right, great. I got lucky. The final comment for me is there's another group that has its oar in the water that you should all be aware of. There are over 60 cities in California that have coastal shoreline, and the League of California Cities, and all of you who are city folks are familiar with them. They set up some years ago a coastal cities group, and there is one representative from each region, and I'm the representative from the San Diego region, and there are 10 cities in San Diego that have coastal shoreline. And then there's representatives from the rest of the state. And we meet regularly, and we meet regularly with Coastal Commission staff, and we do joint workshops with them and do webinars. So this is a pitch for me. If you're in a coastal city, please feel free to contact me anytime. If you have questions or concerns, I will try to help you and let you know what's going on there. And you certainly have the ability to speak directly to the League of Cities, which is active in this area. Yes, Eric.
Just a quick question. The $37 million price tag, is that targeting a sediment drop that would be similar in size to the second regional beach project? Is that what I understood?
Yes, it would be mirroring the amount of participation. Sorry, the podium's in the way. It would be mirroring the same cities participating as they did in Regional Beach Stand Project 2. But again, that's subject to change once from the feasibility study, because as we may know, we might find out maybe some cities more sand rich and they don't want to be participating in the construction or implementation. And so that price tag is subject to change based off of that feasibility.
And, and I would assume the amount of time it takes us to get to that part too, that would subject to changes as well.
As fast as we can get there is the answer. And what
We're
Keith
sprinting.
says is the constraint is the money. All right, for the last call for questions, comments from the group. I'm not seeing in, then we're getting very close to the end of the meeting. Let me ask Keith and also Colleen, if you would like to make a closing comment or two. The floor is yours. Keith?
I do not. Thank you, though.
All
Thank
right,
you for our
great.
participation today.
Then the next Regional Planning Committee meeting is scheduled as a joint session with the Executive Committee of SANDAG on Friday, June 14th, is 2023 at 9 a.m. So if you're on that group, make a note of that. The next meeting of the Shoreline Preservation Working Group will be a special joint working group forum scheduled for July 27 at 10 a.m. So if you're on that group, make note of that. Let me express my personal thanks to Dr. Merrifield and to Keith and Courtney, and also apologize. Some of you I don't know by face, and if I didn't call you by name, that's why. And I can't read your name tags from here. And Colleen was gracious enough to give me a cheat sheet, but I couldn't work with it. So if I didn't know your name or if I didn't recognize you as a mayor or whatever, I apologize. And thank you all for coming, and we are adjourned.
Nicely done.